from Copenhagen Business School, and Sharon has done me the great honor of asking me to introduce her presidential address. We're not sure if we have Roger or Vicky in the room yet, but my introduction is going to take a few minutes, so we're not going to delay any further. So I'm proud to call Sharon Murphy my colleague and friend. I feel I hardly need to expound on Sharon's contribution to the field as a scholar, but I'm going to anyway. There are, I think, 4 books, 3 monographs, and an edited collection, as well as numerous articles, chapters, and cases, meticulously researched, scrupulously written, and trenchantly argued. Sharon's work has deepened and enriched our understanding of US financial, business, and institutional history in the 19th century. It is also intensely human work. As Sharon says in her profile on the Providence College website, she aims at better understanding of the 19th century world by looking through the lens of institutions that intimately affected the lives of everyday people. That is, she aims to write history as if people really mattered. Mattered both in the sense of them making a difference, and mattered in the sense that their lives, all of them, were of value. That spirit of valuing the human is also powerfully present, I think, in the theme that Sharon chose for this year's meeting, doing business in the public good. And it is woven throughout the presidential address that we are about to hear, and which I have had the great privilege of reading in advance. This same spirit infuses Sharon's incredible record of service to the discipline and for this organization specifically, and not simply as the current president and all of the additional roles that entails, president-elect previously, executive committee, budget committee, program committee, and soon to be past president and past president on the board. Although they seem like they're the same thing, really. Sharon also currently serves on the inaugural committee of the Henry Kaufman Financial History Fellowship Program, and she has just embarked on a second stint on the nominating committee, the first time being in 2018-20. But I've barely begun. There's also the Hagley Book Prize Committee, again twice, and that's an enormous task, 2020 to 21 and 2017-18. And I still haven't finished. In addition to all of these, Sharon has also served on the Board of Trustees, the Electronic Media Oversight Committee, the Kerr Prize Committee, and the Emerging Scholars Committee. I don't know about Sharon, but I'm just exhausted reading them. You've also been chair of your department for the last several years as well, I believe.
107 days left.
107 days. I've been watching this count in real time on Facebook for it feels like for about 3 years now. So, and did I forget something? Surely not. Or maybe there's a few editorial duties on a certain journal as well. Yes, Sharon serves as associate editor at Enterprise and Society, which she joined for volume 12, number 2, back in 2011. And in fact, it was for the very same issue that I joined the associate editor team, both of us scouted by a certain Professor Scranton over there. And then finally, and most powerfully, this spirit I have been speaking of valuing the human is there in Sharon's friendships, to which she is fiercely loyal, not least to those rooted in sisterhood. There is, I know, practically a whole generation of female business historians proud to consider themselves as Sharon's mentees. Speaking personally, so far as I can tell, Sharon and I first appeared on the same BHC program for the 2007 meeting in Cleveland. So that is perhaps where we first met, but my memory is fading and dim, so I can't be certain. But starting points hardly matter. It is what endures that matters. And if I can't precisely remember our first meeting, then that means far less than the many get-togethers that there have been since. And that's not just in conference seminar rooms, not only in the emails of routine editorial and committee work, and not even just on the pages of books and journals. So, for example, it gives me great pleasure to remember when my wife Christine and I were able to welcome Sharon and Kono, who's over here with the rest of Sharon's family, to our home, where there was, as I remember, food, some wine, I would imagine, probably, definitely some good conversation, and I hope a break from the grind of archival work, at least for one evening. But I also wanted to include other voices in this testimony, especially those of that generation of younger female historians to whom Sharon is such an important figure. And so I turned to my colleague at CBS, Hannah Knox Tucker, and I make no apology for using her words over mine. And Hannah lays it out with great eloquence. And I quote, "Sharon does not bullshit you." If she disagrees with you, you'll know she's not afraid to tell you why you're wrong, and she's usually right. I think Sharon would happily tell Sven Beckert that the new history of capitalism, an ill-defined label, campaigning for what business historians have been doing well for decades. To some people, that level of honesty might not seem like a good thing, but it means that Sharon's respect is honest and worth earning. While she's radically honest, Sharon never punches down. If you're a junior scholar, she takes the time to show you why your argument is weak and how to strengthen it. This is still Hannah, by the way, not me. Sharon mentors with a genuine interest and compassion for graduate students and concern for their well-being. She goes out of her way to give emerging scholars a time far beyond what is required or even encouraged. She reassured me when I felt uncertain. She provided critical feedback, encouraged me when I applied for jobs. She invited me into the business history, the BHC community, and her warm welcome is part of what keeps me coming back. Sharon also loves business and economic history, and it seems like we all must in this profession. But as those fields waxed and waned in relative importance within the historical discipline, Sharon championed them. It's clear from her scholarship that Sharon believes the details of insurance policies, banknotes, and collateralization are deeply human. Sharon finds the humanity in what others dismiss as dull. That's why I love her. This is Hannah still. And perhaps why she loves this motley crew of business historians. And now me. That's why we all love you, Sharon. It is then my great pleasure and honor to introduce this year's Business History Conference presidential address. I give you Professor Sharon Ann Murphy.
Trying to get my timer on. Thank you so much, Andrew, for that such a kind introduction, and Hannah, thank you, Hannah. And I do have a couple thank yous before I begin. First, is Roger in the room? Is he still? Oh, there's Roger. Okay. First, to Roger. None of these conferences happen without all the hard work and detail work that Roger puts in. He picks the menus, he does the budgets, he makes sure the AV's here, he does everything. So do not underestimate the amount of work that man puts into these meetings. Vicki Howard, where's Vicki? There's Vicki. Vicki, our secretary, keeps everything running. She keeps us on task and makes sure we're on task. Paolo de la Cruz Fernandez, our web editor, promoting and publicizing everything we do, so important. We got Shane Hamilton, who refuses to sit down in the back. He writes the code. Like, who knew that historians could write code? But he's so important too, and responds at all hours of the night when we can't get things working on the website. Carol Lockwood, who couldn't be here, she's still heart and soul, and we all wish her that she gets well soon. So we miss her here. Not on my program committee, but who did a lot of work was actually Bart Elmore. Is Bart here? He's had to leave. He, when I reached out to him and said, I want to do something on the program committee wants to do something on the climate, for the opening plenary. He jumped in with 2 feet. He actually did a lot of work for someone who wasn't actually on the program committee, so I thank him. My program committee was incredible. Michael Aldis, Atiba Perilla, Pertilla. Sorry, I totally massacred your name, and I know your name. Hannah Tucker and Louise Walker. They were fabulous. They were responsive. They, creative in pulling together all the papers that weren't already on panels. So, so much hard work that they put in. Claire Wrigley, Caitlin's GA, did all sorts of database work for us and really helped us get organized, which was important. And gosh, Caitlin, where's Caitlin? Caitlin did more work as a program committee chair. I mean, like, she is vice president, honorary, woman behind the curtain. We all know she's brilliant. You won't be surprised that she is incredibly efficient and organized and gets things done. Like, no one will be surprised by that. She's also the most pleasant person to work with. It was such a treat every time we were meeting in our 3-hour time difference. She was always so great to work with. So thank you so much, Caitlin. I owe her so many favors. I am terrified of when she starts calling them in. And finally, my family is here today. My husband, Ken, my 2 kids, they're so supportive of me and all my craziness and all my time away and busyness. So I really appreciate them being here as well. This is their first presidential address, but this is not actually their first BHC conference. So my daughter first came to the BHC in Milan when she was 4.5 months old. While I was doing conference stuff, her and her father got to go around town, checking out the sites. And then as a family, we got to do some stuff up in the Lake District. And then my son went to his first BHC when he was 3 weeks old in Philadelphia. He actually came to the panels with me and judged the Care Prize. And I think he made a good choice that year. Meanwhile, my daughter got to hang out with her grandparents, gallivanting around Philadelphia, checking out the aquarium, checking out the Liberty Bell. So, but this is the first time they're going to have to endure an actual speech. So, now they're sufficiently embarrassed. The theme of this year's conference is doing business in the public history. But what does it actually mean to do business in the public interest? For people like Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman, the very idea is an oxymoron. By definition, a capitalist business enterprise is a for-profit institution whose sole purpose is self-interest. Proponents of this line of thought often turn to Adam Smith's famous words from The Wealth of Nations to support that argument, although his words are usually taken out of context. Smith said that society is best served when individuals pursue their self-interest on behalf of domestic rather than foreign industry. He generally indeed neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. Yet this idea that self-interest is equivalent to profit maximization is not what Smith actually said, either here or elsewhere in The Wealth of Nations. Profit maximization assumes that the only relevant stakeholders in a firm are the owners or stockholders, not its employees or customers, and certainly not interests outside of the firm, such as local communities or the environment. And even the idea that self-interest more broadly should be the sole guiding principle of every business enterprise assumes that this so-called self-interest, whether for the individual or the business corporation, is something concrete, knowable, definable. It assumes that there is no choice involved and that it's mutually exclusive. It assumes that self-interest itself is a positive good that will lead to a desirable outcome for society. It also assumes no difference in self-interest over the short, medium, or long terms. Finally, it ignores the historical origins of a corporation as creating legal entities with privileges from and duties to the state. Indeed, when Adam Smith referred to the public interest, he was arguing against the mercantile system as being the optimal means of promoting economic growth for the nation as a whole. But his ultimate goal was still the economic well-being of the nation. And yet, despite all these embedded assumptions, this idea that profit maximization is the sole purpose of a capitalist enterprise, the idea that greed is good, still occupies a dominant place in business culture, not only in the United States, but around the world. We have all experienced this, both on the macro and the micro levels, and it had a somewhat formative impact on my own life. So I'll say as an aside, the one instruction I received from Roger Horowitz about this presidential address was that I had to do something biographical. People like biography, he said. So I was born 50 years ago in northern New Jersey as the third and youngest child of an Italian-American mother and an Irish-American father. At the time, my mother was a homemaker, and my father, Joseph, or Jay as he was called, was an associate auditor at a local bank. They had met as first-generation college students in the early 1960s. But when my father left college after flunking out of the engineering school, he couldn't pass physics. My mother left with only an associate's degree. She had really only gone to college to get her MRS or Mrs. degree anyway, and so this was fine by her. But my father was good at math. And luckily for him, his mother, seen here in this picture, possessed a critical piece of social capital. As past BHC president Pam Laird so wonderfully describes in her Hagley Prize-winning book, Pull, Networking and Success Since Benjamin Franklin, connections through family and friends can often be the essential launching pad for someone's career. My grandmother's best friend from high school just happened to be married to the president of a local bank. And he hired Jay as a bank teller. Over the next 28 years, my dad worked his way up the ranks into middle management at the National Community Bank in New Jersey. Soon after I was born, he also began night school, finally earning his bachelor's degree in accounting in 1981 at the age of 39. By the late 1980s, my dad was still working at National Community Bank, but now in the Internal Security Department. And I used to love going with him into the office and examining the fake checks and counterfeit bills that people had tried to use to defraud the bank. Incoming president Stephen Mim likely also would have gotten a kick out of this. And then one afternoon in early December, oops, I went too fast. During my senior year of high school, I returned home from school to find him sitting at the kitchen table in the middle of the day. The bank, though still profitable, had decided to pare its top-heavy management ranks by laying off 50 mid-level employees. Not one upper executive was included in these layoffs. In press releases, the new bank president, who had been appointed to the job less than a week earlier, blamed the recession, with newspaper articles calling the bank the latest recession victim. Yet, even amidst the recession, the bank had already earned $9 million during the first 3 quarters of the year and anticipated solid profits for the fourth quarter as well. The president assured the public, "We have been substantially more profitable than we were in 1990. This bank is more profitable and more liquid than it's been in years." And just in case anyone was concerned about those 50 employees who had just been laid off right before the holidays, the president promised that they would receive varied compensation packages linked to their years of service. So after 28 years of service, my father received a mere 13 weeks of severance pay, a fraction of the corporate average of 1 to 2 weeks per year of service. He was now a 49-year-old man who had never put together a resume in his life, trying to find a new job just as the recession hit, as well as trying to figure out how he would put his youngest child through college. For the next several years, he would join what we would now call the gig economy, as described in Ben Waterhouse's great new book, One Day I'll Work for Myself. He got up at 4 a.m. and delivered newspapers from the back of his hatchback Honda Civic. He worked all sorts of crazy hours as a limo driver. If it had existed at the time, he absolutely would have been an Uber or Lyft driver. The timing of the layoff meant that I was not qualified for any financial aid for college, but I was lucky enough to have cobbled together enough scholarship money and loans for my out-of-state tuition at the University of Virginia, working summers and vacations to cover my room and board. Then, in the mid-1990s, my dad began working an entry-level position in retail at the Home Depot. 14 years later, he would retire from Home Depot, still working a wage position, answering phones in their customer service center. Sadly, he took this change in status personally. He had always been a kind, funny, big-hearted Irishman who taught me always to root for the underdog. But for the last 25 years of his life, he believed he was a failure. He died in 2015, a broken man. Now, the Milton Friedmans of the world might say that the bank had no other option than to lay off these employees. It was in the best interest of the bottom line. But as it would quickly become clear in the months after the layoffs, the bank was actually trying to position itself financially to be taken over by the Bank of New York. As former BHC president Mark Rose documents in his 2019 book, Market Rules, the early 1990s was a period when the regulations governing interstate banking were quickly evolving, and numerous banks attempted to take advantage of these new opportunities. The National Community Bank was one of New Jersey's largest banks and was headquartered in the extremely lucrative northern New Jersey market, a prime target for New York bankers. When rumors of the potential merger began percolating, the National Community Bank's stock price shot through the roof to record levels. And stockholders, as well as those upper management, did indeed make a killing when the merger was finalized in 1993. Yet businesses are not automatons. No invisible hand dictated the necessity of a profitable bank laying off long-tenured workers during the holidays with little to no recompense in order to boost profitability in anticipation of a potentially lucrative merger deal. While academics, politicians, and courts in the United States might debate whether or not corporations are actually legal persons with all the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, as former BHC president Naomi Lamoureux has so ably documented in her extensive research on corporate personhood, in reality, all businesses, from sole proprietorships and partnerships all the way to the largest multinational enterprises, still depend on the decision-making and choices of individuals. Indeed, the chief defense given for the massive surge in CEO compensation packages since the 1980s is that the decisions of individuals at the top can make a profound difference for the success of a company. Yet if self-interest were self-evident, and if businesses operating under a purely capitalist ethos were really led by an invisible hand towards profit maximization, then the individuals comprising the leadership of that enterprise should matter much less. Perhaps these CEOs are acting in their own self-interest, but this may or may not be in the long-term self-interest of the firm. But I don't wish to belabor this point. In coming up with the conference theme, I think I already tipped my hand that I don't buy into the idea that the rationale behind capitalism compels businesses to ignore the public interest. So let's start again. What does it mean to do business in the public interest? At this point, I'm fully aware that I have neither defined the public nor who actually gets to decide what's in the best interest of this amorphous public, nor who gets to decide between potentially conflicting public interests. It also assumes that the public interest is necessarily always something positive for society. For the purposes of the conference, I intentionally left this idea vague. And you all responded with a plethora of wonderful papers and panels, all interpreting this idea from a wide range of perspectives. But I'd now like to narrow this theme down considerably until we end up at one facet that I find particularly interesting and in some cases highly problematic. And as a caveat, I am a US historian primarily, so my examples will largely be from the United States context, although I think that the ideas behind them can apply much more widely. So by far the easiest layer to eliminate from discussion are all practices done in compliance with regulatory requirements. Much of the regulation described by past BHC President Ed Ballison in his Gomery Prize-winning book, Fraud, entails legislation designed to protect some public interest. Yet I'm interested in companies choosing to act in the public interest as opposed to being compelled by some government entity. One of my all-time favorite business history books is Roland Marchand's Creating the Corporate Soul: The Rise of Public Relations and Corporate Imagery in American Big Business, which was the very first winner of the Hagley Prize in 1999. In this beautifully written and illustrated book, Marchand details the careful efforts of the late 19th and early 20th century US firms to create distinctive, personable, compassionate images with the consuming public. And yet ultimately, most of the campaigns discussed by Marchand were about appearances. Corporations needed to convince the public that they were more than greedy, profit-maximizing enterprises, but actions that are primarily public relations ploys with little actual risk or sacrifice on the part of the company are also not what I have in mind. Nor do I mean instances of outright hypocrisy, where the company's public pronouncements are in direct conflict with their private behavior. For example, at the beginning of the 21st century, Volkswagen had positioned itself as an industry leader in environmental sustainability, even winning 2 Green Car of the Year awards in 2009 and 2010. In reality, the company had deliberately installed devices in their cars to produce artificially low emissions results when tested under lab conditions. And in the wake of the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, it has become increasingly common for corporations in the United States to publicly advocate for one position that they perceive as being popular with the public, while contributing to politicians or political advocacy groups that support the exact opposite stance. These also are not quite what I had in mind. At the next level are a wide range of activities that can be lumped together under the mantra of doing well by doing good. These are business models in which doing what is in the public interest easily aligns with corporate goals, or where the business specifically innovates to take advantage of an opportunity which it perceives as being in the public interest. Volkswagen's clean diesel innovation would have fallen under this latter category had they actually succeeded in producing an environmentally friendly engine and then profited from its production. This idea of doing well by doing good is often associated with the idea of corporate social responsibility and has been prominently studied by many people here, including past BHC President Kenley Partito. Growing up, I was extremely close to my paternal grandparents. My grandfather, Austin Murphy, or Huck as he was more commonly known, was the youngest of 8 children. When he was only 3 years old, his father, who had been working at the time as a streetcar conductor, died, leaving his mother to support the large family. She began taking in laundry while the teenage children picked up various jobs on the railroad and in local factories. When Huck was 16 in 1929, on the eve of the Great Depression, he dropped out of high school in order to help provide for his mother. As a 17-year-old in the 1930 census, he listed his occupation as none, while his 3 older sisters and 1 older brother, who still lived at home, all listed various clerical occupations. By all accounts, Huck was extremely talented with electronics. He was a handyman who could fix anything. It's unclear what he actually did for employment throughout the 1930s. But by World War II, he was working at Bendix Aviation. During the 1920s, Bendix was a supplier of components for the budding aviation industry. The company then suffered greatly during the Great Depression, and its founder had to declare bankruptcy. Yet, as with many parts of the US economy, the company's fortunes changed rapidly with the onset of World War II. Bendix became a major manufacturer of radio equipment for military planes, producing approximately 75% of all avionics for US aircraft. Contributing to the war effort enabled Bendix to survive and thrive after the Great Depression. My grandmother later told me Grandpa was real mad that because he wanted to go to war, but was ineligible. I'm not sure whether he was ineligible because he was employed in a critical military industry, or because he was a 28-year-old married man with a baby at home and another on the way. But even though he wasn't able to fight, my grandmother told me how proud he was to be contributing to the war effort through his work at Bendix. As Mark Wilson has demonstrated in his Hagley and Gomery Prize-winning book, Destructive Creation, American Business and the Winning of World War II, it was easy for corporations like Bendix to demonstrate that they were doing business in the public interest by supporting the war effort. Yet in this case, doing business in the public interest was not at all in conflict with profit maximization. So this is also not what I'm interested in. On the flip side, we might look at a corporation doing well by not doing good. By this, I mean those companies who make profit at the expense of the public interest, whether by polluting the environment or harming their workers or hurting consumers. Here's a candid shot of my grandparents in the mid-1960s, alongside 2 aunts and my dad's cousin. Notice my one aunt sitting on the couch holding an ashtray, while both of my grandparents have cigarettes in their hands. Soon after this picture was taken, my grandmother would quit smoking. But my grandfather remained a lifelong smoker, dying of lung cancer in 1985. But companies who actively prey on the public are also not where my interests lie. So I'll put that aside as well. What I'm really interested in are a different set of circumstances. Corporations that make a decision in the public interest without clear evidence that it will benefit their bottom line, and/or cases where it will demonstrably hurt their bottom line to prioritize the public. Or 2, corporations that make a decision in the public interest that actually turn out to be bad for the public interest, possibly because of competing interpretations of public interest, or because of an evolving understanding of the public interest. And finally, corporations that make a decision that's bad for the public interest that also turns out to be bad for their bottom line. So let's start out with this first idea of making decisions in the public interest without an obvious profit maximizing incentive. I think one of the best examples along these lines is also a local story here in Little Rhodey. In 2014, CVS Caremark, the parent company of the CVS chain of pharmacies, which is headquartered here in Rhode Island, announced that they would no longer sell tobacco products in their 7,600 locations. The company's president and CEO stated that cigarettes and tobacco products have no place in a setting where healthcare is delivered. It is the right thing to do. However, he also estimated that the move would cost the company $2 billion annually in lost revenues. On the day of the announcement, CVS's stock price fell 7%. Now, on the one hand, you could argue that this was merely a strategic decision on the part of CVS that would pay obvious dividends in the future. The company was trying to reposition itself away from its retail sales towards more emphasis on the delivery of healthcare services, such as its newly acquired pharmacy benefits management business and its growing number of walk-in minute clinics staffed by nurse practitioners. Both of these aspects of their business model were growing in profitability, and both would help supplant the loss in revenue from tobacco sales. On the other hand, CVS could have pursued both of these new business lines while still selling tobacco products. The two things were not mutually exclusive. Even though there had been some public pushback from people who recognized the hypocrisy of a healthcare company peddling tobacco products, there was no evidence that this hypocrisy was hurting its bottom line. CVS certainly hoped that in the long term, the policy shift would make healthcare providers more likely to do business with CVS, and that it would make it easier to recruit and retain good employees. But none of these long-term outcomes was guaranteed. Further evidence that this decision was not necessarily a profit-maximizing one comes from its competitors. Since CVS stopped selling tobacco products in 2014, none of its competitors have followed suit. Walmart briefly considered whether it should adopt a similar policy to stay competitive with CVS, but ultimately decided that cigarette sales were in keeping with the retailer's brand as serving the mass market. Some executives also thought that Walmart might gain market share in the aftermath of CVS's decision. Walgreens and Rite Aid also stated that they were not interested in telling people what they should or should not buy, and that they didn't want to be seen as being part of the nanny state. Of course, this response assumes that selling tobacco products is somehow integral to a pharmacy business. Would we complain if a grocery store suddenly stopped selling kumquats? But another interesting side question is, do we actually want corporations trying to influence public behavior? And when might that become problematic as well? A second example of a corporation acting for the public interest without clear evidence that it was to their benefit their bottom line, comes from the life insurance industry. During the late 19th century, several American life insurers began selling industrial insurance. These policies targeted lower income families by providing policies in amounts as small as $100, as compared to the thousands of dollars normally required for ordinary life insurance. Premiums ranging from 5 cents to 65 cents were collected on a weekly basis, often by agents coming door to door, instead of on an annual or semi-annual basis. While industrial insurance remained only a fraction of the amount of life insurance in force, the number of policies skyrocketed, growing from less than 250,000 in 1880 to almost 90 million policies by the eve of the Great Depression. Life insurers were certainly doing well, and many executives would argue that these policies were in the public interest by providing a safety net for the low-income families in the event of a catastrophic death. Another potential example of doing well by doing good. We'll put aside some of the critiques of industrial insurance, the moral hazard of providing insurance on children. We'll just put that aside for now. Another time. Beginning in 1908, though, executives at the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, the leading provider of industrial policies, determined that they were in a unique position to help working families beyond just providing insurance policies. The company created a welfare department and hired a prominent sociologist to head the office. One of the defining purposes of this department was to wage war on disease and some of its underlying causes, such as ignorance, insanitation, and poverty. MetLife would take advantage of its array of insurance agents to address public health concerns. Of course, people living longer, healthier lives would be in the long-term best interests of a life insurer. But whether or not an investment in public health would increase corporate profits was much less obvious. Nearly 20% of industrial life insurance death claims in 1909 were from tuberculosis or consumption. Thus, one of the welfare department's first actions was to publish an 8-page pamphlet explaining the causes, prevention, and treatment of the disease. They initially printed 3.5 million copies in 10 different languages and had their agents disperse them throughout the communities where they sold life insurance. Other publications soon followed on such topics as smallpox, dental care, first aid, and exercise. My personal favorite is Understanding Your Teenager. I'm still reading this one. Of course, the MetLife corporate logo and slogan featured prominently on all of these publications, but they were still making a substantial investment in promoting public health. Next, the company created a visiting nursing service. When agents went into policyholders' homes and witnessed someone in need of medical care, they would send a nurse to provide that care at the company's expense. By the end of 1909, the Metropolitan Life was delivering nursing services in 13 cities and had made over 28,000 visits. Just 5 years later, they would be providing these services in over 1,800 cities, big, medium, and small, with nurses making over 1 million visits. This service cost the company more than $500,000 in 1914. At the time of the creation of the welfare department, the MetLife was a publicly traded corporation, and there does not appear to have been much pushback from the shareholders against these activities. And yet, in 1914, the shareholders decided to mutualize the company, retiring all of its capital stock and distributing all future profits among the policyholders. One could even perhaps argue that mutualization itself was a corporate decision that prioritized the public interest in the form of the policyholders over profit maximization. 1914 was also the year of birth for my paternal grandmother, Mildred Bradley Murphy. Until her death in 2006, Mildred was by far the most important person in my life. Unlike my grandfather Huck, Mildred was born into a relatively comfortable middle-class family. By the 1920s, her father was working as a building inspector in Jersey City for the infamous political boss, Mayor Frank Hague. My grandmother once told me that Mayor Hague was actually her godfather and that he bought her a convertible car on her 16th birthday in 1930. Mildred was absolutely a social butterfly. She won Most Popular Girl in Lyndhurst that same year. Now, after graduating from high school in 1931, Mildred began working at the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company in New York City. Clerical work was one of the most common occupations for young, educated, unmarried, native-born, white, middle-class women. In the few photos I have from her work life, she is surrounded by the filing cabinets of the MetLife office. As past BHC president, Joanne Yates has documented both in her book, Structuring the Information Age, as well as a great chapter in A Nation Transformed by Information, these systems of organizing and storing large amounts of data were central to corporations like MetLife and depended on this growing workforce of clerical women. At some point, MetLife awarded Mildred a sterling silver pin from Tiffany & Company for her faithful service. When Mildred and Huck married in 1938, the girls at work celebrated by throwing her a bridal shower at her desk. But unlike many women who were forced to leave their jobs upon marriage, MetLife did not have that policy. She remained in the office for another 2 years until she became pregnant with my father's older brother, born in 1941. The girls again threw her a combined baby shower, going away party at her desk. She would not return to the workforce until her youngest son was a teenager in the 1960s, when she would start doing clerical work again through a temp agency. Yet while MetLife did not require married women to quit their jobs, many other corporations, particularly those that employed large number of women in clerical positions like insurance companies and banks, did have these so-called marriage bars. This is an example of a corporate decision made in the public interest that turns out to be bad for the public interest. The emergence of marriage bars, both in the form of set company policies against hiring or retaining married women, and more informal discriminatory practices forcing married women out of the workforce, emerged in parallel with the rise of the gendered clerical workforce. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Claudia Goldin, who we honored earlier this afternoon at our women's lunch, examined the extent and impact of these marriage bars as part of her path-breaking book, Understanding the Gender Gap. She estimates that at the height of the practice in the 1930s, approximately 50% of female office workers faced marriage bars. So why are these perceived as being in the public interest? How are they not in the public interest? And is this just another example of a corporation disguising something in the public interest that's really profit maximizing for them? So first, marriage bars emerged in the United States around the same time that protective legislation for women and children in the workforce was becoming increasingly acceptable. While many people rejected the idea of passing general laws to protect the working conditions of all workers, it was easier to convince the public that certain classes of people, namely women and children, required such protection. These laws often restricted women from working in certain occupations deemed detrimental to their health, and or restricted their conditions under which they could work in these occupations. And the basic premise behind these laws was that society needed to protect a woman's primary function. In the words of historian Alice Kessler Harris, women in their capacity as childbearers and rearers served the state's welfare in a special way. Although the gendered world of clerical work was hardly dangerous to a woman's health, the popular belief that women belonged in the private domestic sphere of the home still prevailed among most Americans. While poor, foreign-born, and minority women often still needed to work to support their families, clerical work was reserved for middle-class, native-born, white women who should not need to work upon marriage. These corporate marriage bars serve the public interest by reinforcing separate spheres for the middle class. Of course, if this was an ideal to which people already ascribed, one has to ask why formal marriage bars were even necessary. Wouldn't middle-class women choose to leave the workforce upon marriage if that was the natural order? Many of these marriage bars were put in place during the 1910s and 20s, but the number of businesses adopting these policies further increased during the 1930s. The Great Depression added an additional public interest rationalization, as Claudia Goldin has argued. Marriage bars were a socially acceptable means of rationing employment during the 1930s. Of course, this rationalization is also problematic. Marriage bars prevented women from working regardless of the employment status of their husbands, and they would lose their position upon marriage even if they were the only breadwinner. And second, the types of jobs covered by most corporate marriage bars were highly gendered clerical positions. Married women would merely be replaced by unmarried women rather than by unemployed men, which naturally leads to the question of how marriage bars were actually bad for the public interest. First, for the people of the early 20th century who did believe that married women should not work, the policies might have backfired by making women delay marriage and motherhood rather than quit their jobs. Certainly, many young people delayed marriage during the Great Depression due to economic uncertainty. And the disincentives of losing one's job might have further encouraged that delay. While I have no direct evidence that my grandparents delayed their marriage due to the Depression, there is certainly indirect evidence supporting this conjecture. My grandparents met and were dating by at least 1934, when my grandmother was 20 and my grandfather 21. Age at first marriage for American women during the 1920s was about 21 and a half years. So statistically, one would have expected them to marry by 1935. But my grandparents dated for over 4 years, not marrying until 1938, when Huck was 25 and Mildred 24. And Mildred continued working another 2 years until pregnancy, not marriage, at the age of 26, removed her from the workforce. With the economy in recovery due to wartime demands, my grandfather was now able to support his growing family without her income. Looking back from the 21st century, we can see the many other ways that these marriage bars were bad for the public interest. As Golden also argues, marriage bars discourage women from investing in greater skills that they would not be permitted to utilize. They might become typists, but they had less incentive to become accountants. And thus, these restrictions lowered women's rate of return to education. But we should also be querying the motives of the corporations who instituted these bans in the first place. Were they really doing it because it was in the perceived public interest? Or was it merely a convenient excuse aimed at their own profit maximization? The clerical jobs covered by most of these bars were simple, repetitive, and not accompanied by continued increase in productivity with experience. Thus, these marriage bars were a socially acceptable way of terminating the employment of women whose wages would eventually exceed their addition to firm revenue, especially when there was a large pool of young, educated, unmarried women waiting in the wings to take their place at lower wage rates. In contrast, by the 1950s, most of these marriage bars had disappeared, except in certain places such as airline stewardesses, which we talked about at lunch today. Even as the rhetoric around the ideal of the stay-at-home middle-class wife and mother was reaching its climax in the 1950s. Corporations increasingly recognized the value of retaining skilled and trusted employees, even in these gendered clerical positions. And the workforce participation rate of women was changing worldwide. In the United States, it gradually increased from 23% in 1920 to 28% by 1950, before jumping to 40% by 1960. It wasn't the public interest rhetoric that had changed, but rather the self-interest of the corporations themselves. So marriage bars are an example of a corporate policy ostensibly made in the public interest that turned out to be harmful to the public interest. What about corporate policies made in the public interest that were harmful both to the public interest and the corporation itself? I can think of several possible examples of this double harm. For example, many American corporations during the first half of the 20th century potentially hurt their bottom line by refusing to hire Black employees or to sell to Black consumers. At the time, a majority of white Americans endorsed segregation as being in the best interest of the public. And it would take several decades of organized, direct challenge from Black Americans for this viewpoint to be reversed. Some of the greatest successes of the civil rights movement came when they were able to convince businesses that support for segregation was hurting their bottom line. Marcia Chatelain's recent Hagley and Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Franchise, examines this in the case of McDonald's. But the example on which I'd like to end is from my own recent work on banking and slavery. I argue in that book that the evolving financial demands of planters during the 1810s and 20s, particularly in the growing regions of the southern US frontier, propelled the development of innovative banking institutions to address their unique credit needs. Banks operating on the southern frontier were central to the movement of vast numbers of people, both free and enslaved, to the fertile cotton and sugar lands of the American South, which drove the rapid development of the United States by mid-century with its dependence on a slave economy. In all likelihood, without this financial infrastructure, the settlement of the South would have been much slower, with smaller plantations and a much reduced domestic slave trade. During the panics of 1837 and 1839, Southerners quickly found that they had over-leveraged their human property. Frontier banks faced a choice: either foreclose on slaveholding consumers and sell their plantations and enslaved workers at a severe loss, which likely would have had a catastrophic effect on the slave economy of the region, or renegotiate more lenient terms with debtors, which would put the security of the bank itself at risk. In this case, what was best for the public interest, meaning what was in the best interest of the slaveholders, was leniency. Especially in the case of the largest debtors, the banks often treated them as too big to fail, repeatedly renegotiating loan contracts to avoid, at almost any cost, the seizure and sale of land and human property in the midst of the downturn. Having invested so heavily in plantations and enslaved lives during the 1830s, most banks chose to prop up the system of slavery rather than oversee its collapse. By serving as a financial safety net for slaveholders during the Depression, frontier banks helped lay the foundations of the Southern economic boom during the 1850s. Yet the willingness of banks to embrace long-term mortgages on land and human property, and their leniency toward many delinquent slaveholders during the Depression itself, ultimately resulted in the failure of a large percentage of banks, particularly in the frontier South. In effect, many frontier banks sacrificed themselves at the altar of the slave system. Slavery would survive, but at the expense of the banks. So in hindsight, we would say that propping up slavery was a decision that was bad for the greater public interest of the United States, even if it was beneficial to the narrower interests of the slaveholders. And what was bad for the public interest turned out to be bad for the banks as well, as the vast majority of them went bankrupt as a result. So in my story, doing business in the public interest has gone from doing well by doing good to doing badly by behaving badly. Where does this leave us? Some might say that this validates Milton Friedman. The public interest is just too changeable, too conflicting, too fraught with the potential to do harm to justify the risks to a business enterprise. Therefore, we might as well not even try. And yet, just as Roland Marchand documented for the 1890s to 1930s, the desire for corporations to demonstrate that they have a conscience, if not an actual soul, remains extremely high. In a 2023 survey conducted by Gallup and Bentley University, located just a few miles north of here, over 80% of Americans believe it is extremely important that businesses make money in ethical ways and compensate all workers fairly. But less than 1/3 think businesses are effectively doing both. 88% of Americans believe businesses have a great deal or some power to positively impact people's lives, although only 58% say these organizations are very or somewhat effective in doing so. And 71% of workers under the age of 30 would move jobs to make a greater positive impact on the world. And 29% of such workers would take a 10% pay cut to do so. Corporations are not people, but they are comprised of people with all their many flaws. If the corporation has a soul, if it has a conscience, it is only because of the choices ultimately made by those same flawed people. There's a very old saying that the perfect is the enemy of the good. Corporations doing business in the public interest aren't always going to get it right. And there are times when they may actually get it very, very wrong. But as we discussed during the opening plenary in the case of the climate crisis, the potential benefit of businesses harnessing Their immense power on behalf of a public interest is quite large. It may be asking too much to expect businesses to act on behalf of a public interest when it is potentially harmful to their existence. But it is not too much to ask them to consider the various public interests involved when they are making choices, and to figure out how they can both do well and do good. But it is ultimately up to the public itself to be monitoring these decisions, both to reward those businesses that are stepping up to the challenge and to discipline those businesses who are behaving in ways that are detrimental to the public interest. Thank you.